The choices we make ripple far beyond what we can see, shaping not just our lives, but the lives of others. Some choices come from selfish desires, others from fear, but every choice leaves a mark. This is the story of Precious, a young woman whose decisions led her down a path of heartbreak and redemption, a story that reminds us of the power of forgiveness and the human capacity for change. Welcome to Taupe Stories. Let us know the city you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Once upon a time, in the bustling town of Amara, there lived a young woman named Precious, whose beauty was the talk of the town. Amara was a place of contradiction, a melting pot of tradition and modernity. It was a town where the hum of motorcycles intertwined with the bells of evening church services, where vibrant markets spilled into narrow alleyways, and where dreams of prosperity often collided with the harsh realities of life. In this lively setting, Precious stood out like a star. She was stunning, with a flawless complexion, striking eyes, and a smile that could light up the darkest room, even as a child. Her beauty drew attention, and neighbors would often remark, "This one will break hearts one day." But behind her captivating exterior lay a girl whose life was shaped by the complex dynamics of her family, her environment, and her inner struggles. Precious was born into a deeply religious family. Her father, Pastor Jackson, was a towering figure in Amara, a charismatic pastor and founder of Mount of Hope Ministries, one of the town's most respected churches. Pastor Jackson's sermons were legendary, filled with fire and brimstone, but also messages of hope and redemption. His wife, Blessing, was his perfect complement, a gentle, nurturing woman who worked tirelessly to support both her husband's ministry and the community. To outsiders, their family seemed perfect, a shining example of faith and unity. Pastor Jackson and Blessing were admired for their devotion, and they dreamed of raising Precious to follow in their footsteps. From a young age, Precious was immersed in the world of the church. Sundays were sacred, filled with hymns, prayers, and long sermons. Weekdays were no different, as Bible studies and youth fellowships filled her schedule. Her parents instilled in her the values of humility, obedience, and faith, believing they were setting her on the path to righteousness. But Precious often felt stifled. While she respected her parents' dedication, she couldn't help but feel disconnected from their strict teachings. She struggled with the weight of their expectations and the constant pressure to be the pastor's perfect daughter. Amara's streets were a world apart from the sheltered environment of Precious's home. The town buzzed with life, a kaleidoscope of colors, sounds, and stories. Traders shouted to attract customers, young men sped by on motorbikes, and women in brightly colored wrappers gathered to gossip about the latest town scandals. For Precious, the streets represented freedom, a tantalizing escape from the rigid rules of her household. As a child, she would often watch older girls with admiration. These were girls who seemed fearless, strutting confidently through the market in their fashionable clothes, laughing loudly and speaking of adventures in the city. One girl in particular caught her attention, Chioma, the daughter of a wealthy trader. Chioma was everything Precious wasn't: bold, glamorous, and unbothered by rules. She wore imported dresses, carried expensive handbags, and spoke of evenings spent in luxury hotels. To Precious, Chioma seemed like the embodiment of freedom and success. It wasn't long before Precious began to emulate her. At first it was small things: sneaking out of the house to attend parties, borrowing Chioma's clothes, and experimenting with makeup. But these small acts of rebellion soon grew into a complete rejection of her parents' values. By the time Precious turned 16, her relationship with her parents had become strained. She began skipping church, spending more time with Chioma and her circle of friends. "Precious, where are you going dressed like that?" Jackson would demand when she tried to leave the house in a short dress. "To live my life," she would reply defiantly. Blessing tried a gentler approach, often pleading with her daughter. "My child, this path you're on will only lead to pain. Come back to God before it's too late." However, but Precious was unmoved. To her, their warnings were nothing more than attempts to control her. Her rebellion reached its peak when she began dating wealthy men, some of whom were married. Chioma introduced her to the world of sugar daddies, older men who lavished her with money and gifts in exchange for her company. Precious quickly adapted to this new lifestyle, learning how to charm and manipulate her admirers to get what she wanted. The final blow came when Precious was caught in a scandal involving members of her father's church. Several men had been secretly meeting her, offering money and material goods in exchange for her attention. When the truth came out, it rocked the congregation. Pastor Jackson's daughter is no better than a harlot, some whispered. Others were less forgiving. How can he lead us when his own household is in disarray? The shame was too much for Jackson and Blessing to bear. One evening, after yet another argument, Pastor Jackson made a heartbreaking decision. "If you cannot respect this family or the values we stand for," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "you are no longer welcome here." Blessing, though heartbroken, agreed. "We love you, Precious," she said through tears, "but we cannot support this life you've chosen." That night, Precious packed her belongings and left the house. As she walked away, she felt a mix of emotions: freedom, defiance, and a lingering sadness she refused to acknowledge. By the age of 20, Precious had fully embraced a new identity, one far removed from the dutiful daughter her parents had raised. She became known as the daughter of the city's hotels, a nickname whispered with equal parts admiration and disdain. It was a title that symbolized her rise to prominence in a world of luxury, excess, and indulgence. Precious had crafted a reputation for herself as a woman who could captivate anyone she encountered. Married or single, young or old, rich or richer, men were drawn to her like moths to a flame. Her life was a whirlwind of grand parties where laughter, music, and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air. Precious was always the centerpiece, draped in designer dresses that accentuated her flawless beauty. The wealthy men who adored her spared no expense, showering her with the latest fashions, dazzling jewelry, and keys to luxury cars. She frequented the city's most opulent hotels, from the marble-clad lobbies to penthouse suites that overlooked the bustling skyline. The whispers followed her wherever she went. "That's Precious, the one who never pays for anything herself. Men are willing to go broke just to spend one night with her." But the journey to this glamorous life had not been as seamless as it appeared. The first night after being cast out of her parents' home was a harsh awakening. With only a small suitcase and a handful of belongings, Precious wandered the streets of Amara, unsure of where to go. She had no plan, no home, and no one to call for help. The vibrant streets that once felt like a playground now seemed hostile, the chatter of vendors and the glow of streetlights, a stark contrast to her growing sense of isolation. Her feet ached as she walked aimlessly, the weight of her rebellion pressing down on her. As night fell, Precious found herself sitting on a bench at the edge of the marketplace. The once buzzy stalls were now deserted, and the chill of the evening air gnawed at her. She hugged her suitcase tightly, her confidence shaken. For the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The sound of heels clicking against the pavement broke her thoughts. She looked up to see Chioma, her glamorous and self-assured friend, striding toward her. Chioma had heard about Precious' fallout with her parents and had come looking for her. "Well, well," Chioma said with a smirk, her tone laced with amusement. "So, the pastor's daughter is finally free." Precious forced a smile, trying to hide her vulnerability. I guess you could say that." Chioma tilted her head, studying her friend. "You look lost, Precious. Tell me, where are you staying tonight?" Precious hesitated, embarrassed to admit the truth. Haven't figured that out yet." Chioma laughed, a rich, confident sound. "Typical. Don't worry, darling. You'll stay with me tonight." Relief washed over Precious as she followed Chioma to her apartment. It was a modest place, but it exuded an air of sophistication. Expensive perfumes lingered in the air, and designer handbags were casually draped over the furniture. "Make yourself at home," Chioma said, handing Precious a glass of wine. "But let me give you some advice. If you want to survive out here, you can't be soft. This world isn't for the weak, especially not for girls like us." Over the next few days, Chioma introduced Precious to a life she had only glimpsed before. She taught her the unspoken rules of their world, how to charm wealthy men, negotiate favors, and maintain control in every interaction. "It's all a game," Chioma explained one evening, her voice dripping with confidence. "Men think they're in charge, but they're not. You have something they want, and as long as you play it right, you'll always win." Precious listened intently, soaking in every word. She practiced Chioma's techniques, from perfecting her walk to mastering the art of casual flirtation. Chioma took her to upscale restaurants and exclusive parties, introducing her to a network of influential men. One such man was Chief Adek Kunale, a wealthy businessman who owned a chain of hotels in the city. He was captivated by Precious from the moment he saw her, and Chioma wasted no time in setting up an introduction. "Chief is generous," Chioma whispered to Precious before they approached him. "But don't let him think he's in control. Make him chase you." Precious followed Chioma's advice to perfection. By the end of the evening, Chief Adekunle had gifted her an expensive necklace and offered her the key to one of his luxury suites. It was her first taste of the life Chioma had promised, and she was hooked. As weeks turned into months, Precious's reputation began to grow. She became a regular at the city's finest hotels, where staff greeted her by name and men vied for her attention. Each night brought new admirers and lavish gifts, cash, designer clothes, even cars. Her nickname, Daughter of the City's Hotels, was born during this time. It was whispered in hushed tones, both in admiration and judgment. Precious reveled in the attention, convinced that she had found the secret to happiness. But behind the glamour, there were cracks in her facade. There were nights when she sat alone in a lavish hotel suite, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The silence was deafening, and for brief moments, she wondered if this was truly the life she wanted. She buried these thoughts deep within her, dismissing them as fleeting doubts. "Happiness is about living in the moment," she told herself. "I have everything I could ever want." For Precious, the future was an abstract concept, something she rarely thought about. She was focused on the present, determined to enjoy every moment of her newfound freedom and success. But her choices, like ripples in a pond, were beginning to set the stage for a series of events that would challenge everything she believed about herself and the life she had built. The journey ahead would force her to confront the consequences of her decisions, the pain of her past, and the emptiness that no amount of wealth or attention could fill. Life has a way of catching up, even when we think we've outrun its grasp. Precious, now fully immersed in her life of indulgence and luxury, had become an expert at brushing aside consequences. She had built her world on distraction, parties, expensive gifts, and the admiration of men who fell over themselves to win her favor. But the body has a way of demanding attention, no matter how fiercely the mind tries to ignore it. At first, Precious dismissed the subtle changes she began to notice. Occasional fatigue, waves of nausea, and unexpected dizziness that left her momentarily disoriented. She blamed it on exhaustion from her endless late nights, laughing off her symptoms as nothing more than the cost of living a vibrant and carefree life. However, as the weeks went by, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Her appetite changed, her energy levels dropped, and the dizziness grew more frequent. Even her closest friend, Chioma, began to notice. "You look different," Chioma remarked one evening as they prepared for a party. "Are you sure you're okay?" Precious waved her off. "It's nothing, probably just stress." But deep down, a nagging unease began to take root. Precious decided it was time to see a doctor. One humid morning, dressed in a fitted designer gown and oversized sunglasses, Precious made her way to a private hospital in the heart of the city. She exuded her usual confidence, walking past other patients with the air of someone accustomed to special treatment. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, she felt a growing knot of anxiety. After a series of tests, the doctor returned to the room, his expression unusually serious. "Miss Precious," he began, his voice steady but cautious. "We need to talk about your health." Precious leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. "Go ahead, doctor. What's the verdict?" The doctor adjusted his glasses, consulting the clipboard in his hands. "The tests confirm that you are pregnant, about 8 weeks along." Precious froze. For a moment, she stared at him, stunned into silence. Then she let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Pregnant? That's impossible. Doctor, there must be a mistake." The doctor shook his head. "There's no mistake, Miss Precious. The results are conclusive." The word pregnant sent Precious spiraling into memories she had long tried to suppress. This wasn't her first time hearing those words from a doctor. Several months earlier, she had found herself in a similar situation, sitting in another clinic with the same unexpected news. Back then, her reaction had been immediate and unshaken. "I'm not keeping it," she had declared, without hesitation. "Just tell me when we can schedule the procedure." At the time, the doctor, an older man with years of experience, had tried to warn her. "Miss Precious, you've had 2 abortions in the past. Each one comes with risks, especially when done close together. Your uterus has already sustained damage. Are you sure you want to proceed?" Precious had brushed off his concerns. "Doctor, I'm not here for a lecture. Just do your job." Reluctantly, the doctor had performed the procedure, but complications arose during recovery. Precious experienced severe bleeding that required immediate medical intervention. She had spent 3 days in the hospital, her body weak and racked with pain. When the bleeding finally subsided, the doctor had visited her bedside with a stern expression. "Miss Precious," he said, "this has to be your last abortion. Your uterus has been severely compromised. If you try this again, you could face life-threatening complications or even lose your ability to have children altogether." Precious had nodded at the time, more out of a desire to end the conversation than genuine understanding. She had no intention of ever wanting children, so the warning seemed irrelevant. Back to the present, a defiant decision now. Sitting in front of the new doctor, Precious felt the weight of those earlier warnings, but she wasn't ready to let go of her lifestyle, and the idea of carrying a child was unthinkable. "Doctor," she said sharply, masking her unease with confidence, "let's not waste time. You know what to do. Schedule the procedure." The doctor hesitated, setting down his clipboard. "Miss Precious, I've reviewed your medical history and I must strongly advise against this. Your body has suffered significant trauma from previous procedures. Another abortion could cause irreversible damage, or worse, cost you your life." Precious narrowed her eyes, her irritation rising. "Are you refusing to help me?" "I'm not refusing," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "I'm trying to protect you. Please, reconsider." Precious scoffed, her voice dripping with defiance. "If you won't do it, I'll find someone who will." She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the office, determined to find another clinic. Over the next week, Precious visited 3 different clinics, hoping to find a doctor willing to perform the procedure. But each time, she received the same response. "It's too risky," they all said. "Your body can't handle another abortion." The rejection left Precious feeling trapped. For the first time, she couldn't manipulate her way out of a problem. The very thing she had built her life around, control, was slipping through her fingers. Her frustration boiled over during a conversation with Chioma. "I can't believe this is happening," Precious vented, pacing back and forth in Chioma's apartment. "There has to be a way. I can't let this ruin my life." Chioma, lounging on the couch, raised an eyebrow. "Maybe it's time to face reality, Precious. The doctors are probably right. You're not invincible, you know." "Face reality," Precious snapped. "Do you know what having a baby would mean for me? My life would be over." Chioma shrugged, unfazed by her friend's outburst. "You're acting like it's the end of the world. Women have kids all the time and move on. You'll figure it out." But Precious wasn't ready to accept defeat. She considered dangerous herbal remedies she had heard about in whispers, but even her boldness faltered when she learned of the potential consequences. Each option felt like a dead end, and Precious was forced to confront the one reality she had been avoiding. She would have to keep the baby. As the weeks passed, Precious reluctantly began to adjust to her new reality. She avoided her usual haunts, afraid of the questions and gossip her growing belly would provoke. She moved to a smaller town, seeking anonymity, and began preparing for the arrival of a child she had no intention of loving. But even as she tried to push forward, bitterness festered in her heart. The child represented everything she despised: sacrifice, responsibility, and the loss of the freedom she had worked so hard to achieve. She didn't see him as a life to be cherished, but as a burden she had been forced to carry. And as her due date approached, Precious began to hatch a plan, one that would allow her to rid herself of the child and return to the life she had left behind. By the 7th month of her pregnancy, Precious had reluctantly accepted that she would have to carry the child to term. She decided to leave the city, fearing that staying would lead to questions and rumors that could tarnish her carefully crafted image. Packing a few belongings, she moved to a smaller town, choosing anonymity over the prying eyes of her glamorous social circle. 9 months after learning she was pregnant, Precious gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The nurses cooed over the infant, marveling at his delicate features and healthy cries, but Precious felt no joy. As she looked at the child in her arms, all she saw was a symbol of her suffering. The long months of discomfort, the isolation from her usual life, the career opportunities she had missed, all of it she blamed on him. The nurses noticed her cold demeanor. "He's a blessing," one of them said gently. "A new beginning." But Precious only muttered under her breath, "He's a curse." She named the boy Teo, a name she chose without much thought, one that would allow her to sever emotional ties. She refused to hold him, feed him, or even look at him for long. Late one night, as Teo lay crying in his crib, Precious sat by the window, her thoughts racing. She couldn't do this. She couldn't be tied down, sacrificing her youth and freedom for a child she never wanted. She made up her mind. Grabbing a blanket, she wrapped Teo tightly, ignoring his soft cries. She slipped out of the house under the cover of darkness, her steps purposeful and unrelenting. She walked to a nearby slum, a place she had only ever seen from the window of her car. The stench of garbage and the hum of mosquitoes filled the air. Precious barely noticed. Finding a secluded spot near a row of shacks, she placed Teo on the ground. "Someone will find you," she muttered, more to herself than to the child. Without looking back, she walked away, her heart hardened against his cries. The next morning, Precious returned to the city. To her friends and acquaintances, she spun a tale of having travelled abroad for a few months. "I needed a break," she said, laughing as she recounted imaginary adventures. Her charm quickly won back their attention, and she resumed her life as though nothing had changed. Parties, luxurious hotel stays, and expensive gifts once again became her norm. The memory of Teo, his cries echoing in the night, was something she pushed deep into the recesses of her mind. But life, as Precious would soon learn, has a way of bringing the past back to the surface, no matter how deeply we tried to bury it. The baby's cries pierced the quiet of the slum, a sound so raw and desperate that it seemed to echo off the crumbling walls and dilapidated shacks. The people who heard it stopped in their tracks, their faces etched with confusion and concern, yet none dared to approach. "Who could leave a baby here?" one woman whispered to her companion, shaking her head in disbelief. "A child abandoned in a place like this?" another murmured, glancing around nervously. "What kind of heartless person does that?" The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent, tugging at the conscience of those who stood nearby. Still, fear and hesitation kept them rooted to their spots. Among the hesitant crowd was a man named David, a carpenter known in the community for his kindness and generosity. David was on his way home after a long day of work, carrying a box of tools and thinking of the simple meal awaiting him. When he heard the cries, his heart sank. But David ignored the warnings. Following the cries, he found the infant lying on a threadbare blanket, his tiny fists clenched in distress. The sight broke David's heart. The baby's face was red from crying, and his small body trembled in the cool night air. Without hesitation, David bent down and scooped the baby into his arms, cradling him gently. "Don't worry, little one," he whispered, his voice soft and reassuring. "I'll take care of you." David hurried home, the baby nestled in his arms. His wife, Nguyen, was preparing dinner when he walked through the door. The sight of her husband carrying an infant stopped her in her tracks. "David!" she exclaimed, her eyes wide with shock. "Where did you get that baby?" David set the baby down on their worn couch, his expression serious. "I found him in the slum," he explained. "Someone abandoned him there. He was crying, Ngozi. I couldn't just leave him." Ngozi's initial reaction was a mix of worry and disbelief. "Do you know what you're doing? What if someone accuses us of kidnapping? This could bring trouble, David." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Ngozi, this child was left to die. I couldn't walk away, not when I had the chance to save him. If we don't take him in, who will?" Ngozi's gaze softened as she looked at the baby. His cries had quieted, and he now lay peacefully, his small hands clutching at the blanket David had wrapped around him. Something about the child tugged at her heart, a feeling she couldn't explain. "Let me hold him," she said quietly. David carefully handed the baby to her, and as Ngozi held him close, she felt an unexpected connection. His tiny fingers brushed against her cheek, and tears welled up in her eyes. "He's so small," she whispered, "and so helpless." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We can give him a home, Ngozi. We've prayed for years for a child. Maybe this is God's answer." After a moment of silence, Ngozi nodded. "All right," she said softly. "But we have to be careful. People will talk, and they'll watch us closely." That night, David and Ngozi bathed the baby, washing away the dirt and grime from the slum. They wrapped him in clean clothes, ones that had been sitting unused in a drawer for years, remnants of the hope they had once had for their own child. As they sat together, watching the baby sleep, David spoke. "We need to give him a name. He's part of our family now." Ngozi smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over the baby's soft cheek. "Let's call him Segun. It means victory. He's a victory over the pain and emptiness we've felt for so long." David nodded, the name resonating deeply with him. "Segun it is," he said. Word spread quickly about the mysterious baby that David and Ngozi had taken in. In a community as close-knit as theirs, news travelled fast. People whispered about the couple's decision, some with admiration, others with suspicion. "Why would they take in someone else's child?" one neighbour asked. "What if the real parents come looking for him?" "They're good people," another replied. "Maybe they're just trying to do the right thing." Despite the murmurs, David and Ngozi remained steadfast. They poured their love into Segun, treating him as though he were their biological child. They fed him, sang him lullabies, and prayed over him every night. As the weeks turned into months, Segun began to thrive. His cries were replaced with coos and laughter, and his small presence brought an undeniable warmth to David and Ngozi's home. For a couple who had spent 10 long years yearning for a child, Segun was nothing short of a miracle. David would often cradle Segun in his arms after a long day of work, marveling at how something so small could bring so much joy. "You've given us a reason to hope again," he would whisper to the baby. Ngozi too found herself transformed by Segun's arrival. She delighted in every milestone, his first smile, his first laugh, the way he reached out for her when he was hungry. For the first time in years, their home felt complete. But even as Segun grew into a happy and healthy baby, the couple knew their decision would always be scrutinized. Some in the community were supportive, bringing small gifts and offering help. Others remained skeptical, their whispers a constant reminder of the judgment that lingered. "Do they really think they can raise someone else's child as their own?" a neighbour muttered one day. "They'll prove everyone wrong," another replied. That child is lucky to have them. Despite the challenges, David and Ngozi remained committed to giving Segun the best life they could. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Zakun had brought light into their lives, and they would do everything in their power to protect and nurture him. Zakun grew into a kind-hearted and intelligent boy, the pride and joy of David and Ngozi. Despite their modest means, they ensured he never lacked love, education, or a sense of belonging. Their small home was filled with laughter, warmth, and the values they instilled in him: honesty, resilience, and compassion. David often told Sagun, "The measure of a man isn't in where he begins, but in what he becomes." These words became a mantra in their household, a reminder that the past did not have to define the future. But the world outside their home was not as kind. At school, Sagun faced a reality far harsher than the one his loving parents had created for him. The whispers about his mysterious origins had followed him into the classroom, growing into cruel taunts and mockery from his peers. "Look, it's the Slum baby," a boy jeered one morning, pointing at Segun as he walked into the schoolyard. "Hey Segun," another chimed in. "Did your demon mother teach you how to fight?" The taunts escalated as the children invented songs to humiliate him. One particularly cruel verse echoed in Segun's ears. Slum baby, left to die, oh so shady. No one wants a demon's son, dirty boy, you're the cursed one." Segun tried to ignore them, focusing on his studies and pretending their words didn't hurt, but inside he felt an ache he couldn't shake. A deep, gnawing sense of isolation and shame. One afternoon, after enduring another day of bullying, Sebun returned home unusually quiet. He went straight to his room, skipping the playful chatter he usually shared with Naguzi in the kitchen or the stories he loved to tell David about his lessons at school. David noticed the change immediately. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, he gently placed a hand on Sebun's shoulder. "B-boy, what's troubling you? You've been so quiet lately." Segun hesitated, staring down at his plate. He didn't want to burden his parents, who had already done so much for him, but the weight of his feelings was too heavy to bear alone. Finally, he looked up, tears glistening in his eyes. "They call me names, Dad. They say I'm a slum baby, that a demon left me to die." Noguzi gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. David's face hardened, his heart breaking for his son. "Who says this to you?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. "Everyone," Segund whispered. "At school, they sing songs about me. They say I don't belong." David knelt beside Segund, his hands resting gently on the boy's shoulders. "Listen to me, my son," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "What they say about you is not the truth. You are not defined by where you came from or by the ignorance of others. You are my son, and I love you more than anything in this world." Olive paused. "B-boy, what's troubling you? You've been so quiet lately." Segun hesitated, staring down at his plate. He didn't want to burden his parents, who had already done so much for him, but the weight of his feelings was too heavy to bear alone. Finally, he looked up, tears glistening in his eyes. "They call me names, Dad. They say I'm a slum baby, that a demon left me to die." Noguzi gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. David's face hardened, his heart breaking for his son. "Who says this to you?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. "Everyone," Segund whispered. "At school, they sing songs about me. They say I don't belong." David knelt beside Segund, his hands resting gently on the boy's shoulders. "Listen to me, my son," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "What they say about you is not the truth. You are not defined by where you came from or by the ignorance of others. You are my son, and I love you more than anything in this world." Olive paused. "Do you understand?" Segun nodded, though his tears continued to fall. David continued. "You are strong, Segun. You have a heart that is kinder and braver than most people ever will. Those who mock you do so because they don't know your story. But I know it. Your mother knows it, and we know the truth. You are a blessing, not a curse." Nogizi joined them, pulling Segun into a hug. "You are our miracle, Segun," she said softly. "Never forget that." Their words brought Segun some comfort, but they couldn't erase the pain entirely. The stigma clung to him, a shadow he couldn't escape. Though Segun excelled academically, earning the praise of his teacher, the bullying at school persisted. It didn't help that he was different from the other children, not in looks or intelligence, but in the way he carried himself. He was quieter, more introspective, and often kept to himself. He began to question his place in the world. Why did my real parents leave me? He wondered late at night as he stared at the ceiling. Was I not good enough? Was I truly cursed? These thoughts gnawed at him, fueling a quiet anger and sadness that he struggled to reconcile. He couldn't bring himself to ask David or Ngozi for answers, fearing it would hurt them. But the questions refused to fade. Despite the bullying and his internal struggles, Segun found solace in small victories. He was a gifted student, excelling in mathematics and science. His teachers often praised him, calling him a star in the making. One teacher, Mrs. Adebayo, noticed his withdrawn demeanor and took him under her wing. "Segun, you have a brilliant mind," she told him one day after class. "Don't let anyone dim your light. You are destined for great things." Her encouragement gave him a sense of hope, a belief that perhaps he could rise above the stigma that haunted him. At home, David and Ngozi continued to shower him with love and support. David, ever the storyteller, often shared tales of great men who had overcome adversity. "Segun, remember this," he would say. His teachers often praised him, calling him a star in the making. One teacher, Mrs. Adebayo, noticed his withdrawn demeanor and took him under her wing. "Segun, you have a brilliant mind," she told him one day after class. "Don't let anyone dim your light. You are destined for great things." Her encouragement gave him a sense of hope, a belief that perhaps he could rise above the stigma that haunted him. At home, David and Ngozi continued to shower him with love and support. David, ever the storyteller, often shared tales of great men who had overcome adversity. "Segun, remember this," he would say. The world Precious had once commanded with her beauty and charm was slowly slipping through her fingers. Though she had spent years dazzling wealthy men, collecting gifts and basking in luxury, the cracks in her life had begun to show. Her latest benefactor, Senator Samuel, was among the most powerful men she had ever entertained. A man of immense wealth and influence, he was a regular feature in the tabloids, known for his extravagant lifestyle and her 5 wives. But to Precious, Samuel represented more than just wealth. He was her last hope for stability. Precious had long dreamed of transforming her position as his mistress into something more permanent. She imagined herself as his 6th wife, her status elevated, her future secured. She believed that if she bore him a child, her place in his life would be solidified. But no matter how hard she tried, that dream remained out of reach. Being Senator Samuel's mistress came with its own set of rules. He lavished Precious with gifts, designer clothes, luxury cars, and enough money to keep her living in comfort. But there were conditions attached. She had to remain discreet, never making demands, and always being available when he called. Precious played the role perfectly at first, attending glamorous parties on his arm and soaking in the admiration of others. But as the years passed, the lack of commitment began to weigh on her. She wanted more than the fleeting adoration of strangers, more than the temporary thrill of material wealth. "Samuel," she said one evening, as they dined in his sprawling estate, "don't you think it's time to make things official between us? I've been loyal to you for so many years." Samuel laughed, his voice dismissive. "Precious, you know how things are. My hands are tied. Besides, you're already living the good life, aren't you? Why complicate things with a marriage certificate?" His words stung, but Precious forced a smile. "Of course, you're right," she said, masking her frustration. But inside, her resentment festered. Adding to her despair was her inability to conceive a child. Precious had always been indifferent about motherhood, seeing children as a hindrance to her lifestyle. But as she grew older, she began to see them as a ticket to security. If she could give Samuel a child, preferably a son, she believed he would have no choice but to make her his wife. Yet, no matter how much she tried, pregnancy eluded her. She visited countless doctors, each one delivering the same devastating news. Her body had been damaged by years of neglect and multiple abortions. "I'm sorry, Miss Precious," one doctor told her gently. "Your chances of conceiving are extremely low. The damage to your uterus is extensive. Even with advanced treatments, there's no guarantee." Precious refused to accept this. She sought out traditional healers, herbalists, and even spiritualists, spending large sums of money on remedies and rituals that promised to restore her fertility. She swallowed bitter concoctions, endured painful treatments, and followed every instruction given to her, no matter how absurd. But nothing worked. When he did see her, their conversations were brief and transactional. "Here's some money for your rent," he said one evening, handing her a thick envelope before rushing out the door. Precious clutched the envelope tightly, her anger bubbling beneath the surface. She wanted to scream, to demand more, but she knew it would only push him further away. The turning point came during a high-profile event Samuel invited her to attend. Precious spent hours preparing, determined to remind him of the woman he had fallen for. She wore an elegant gown, her makeup flawless, her confidence carefully reconstructed. But when they arrived, Samuel barely acknowledged her. Instead, he spent the evening lavishing attention on one of his wives, introducing her to influential guests and speaking of her accomplishments with pride. Precious felt invisible, her presence reduced to that of an accessory. That night, as they drove home, she finally broke. "Samuel," she said, her voice trembling, "I can't do this anymore. I need to know where I stand with you. Am I just a mistress to be discarded when I'm no longer useful?" Samuel sighed, his tone exasperated. "Precious, we've been over this. You knew what this was from the start. Don't make this more than it needs to be." His words shattered her. For the first time, she saw the truth of her situation. She was expendable, a fleeting chapter in his life. In the days that followed, Precious withdrew from the world. She stopped attending parties, ignored calls from friends, and spent most of her time alone in her apartment. The vibrant, confident woman she had once been was now a shadow of herself. Her savings dwindled as she poured money into desperate attempts to conceive. She stopped taking care of herself, her once glamorous appearance fading into neglect. The realization that Samuel would never marry her, combined with her inability to have children, plunged Precious into a deep depression. She began to wonder if her life had any meaning at all. Late one night, she stared at her reflection in the mirror, her eyes hollow and filled with tears. "How did I end up here?" she whispered. "I had everything. And now I have nothing." The choices she had made, the bridges she had burned, and the lives she had hurt all came crashing down on her, leaving her with nothing but regret. For the first time in years, Precious allowed herself to confront the pain she had buried for so long. She knelt on the cold floor of her apartment, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. "God," she cried, "I don't know if you're listening, but if you are, please help me. I'm lost. I've made so many mistakes. I'll do anything to make things right. Just show me the way." But the silence that followed was deafening, and Precious was left to face the emptiness alone. Her downfall was complete. The woman who had once captivated the city was now a prisoner of her own despair, with no clear path to redemption. Fate has a way of weaving lives together, even those torn apart by time and circumstance. For Segu, now a brilliant young man on the verge of becoming a doctor, the slum where his life began was a distant memory. He had worked tirelessly to rise above the stigma of his past, excelling in school and earning a scholarship to one of the country's most prestigious universities. Despite his achievements, Segu remained deeply compassionate. His dream of becoming a doctor was not just about personal success. It was about giving back to those who, like him, had been abandoned or left behind. One fateful afternoon, while driving through the slum on his way to a community outreach program organized by his medical school, Segun's life took an unexpected turn. The narrow, uneven roads of the slum were crowded with vendors, children playing, and people going about their daily struggles. Segun navigated carefully, his eyes scanning the path ahead. Suddenly, a figure in a wheelchair rolled into the street, seemingly on purpose. Segun slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt just inches from the woman. His heart raced as he jumped out of the car, rushing toward her. "Madam, are you all right?" he asked, his voice trembling with concern. The woman looked up at him, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow. Her expression was a mixture of despair and defiance. "Why didn't you just kill me?" she said, her voice cracked and bitter. "It would have been a mercy. My life is worthless." Segun was taken aback. He had seen despair before, but never so raw, so palpable. He crouched down beside her, his voice gentle. "You shouldn't say that. Let me help you. Can you tell me your name?" The woman hesitated, her lips trembling as if the act of speaking was painful. "Precious," she finally whispered. Segun's heart ached for her. She looked frail, her clothes worn and her wheelchair battered. The lines on her face told a story of suffering, and her words hinted at a life filled with regret. Without a second thought, Segun decided to take her to the hospital. "Madame Precious," he said softly, "I'm going to take you somewhere safe. Please, trust me." Precious didn't resist as he lifted her into the car. She stared out the window in silence during the drive, the weight of her despair filling the space between them. Segun couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to this point. At the hospital, Segun ensured Precious was admitted and given immediate care. As she rested in a clean bed, he sat by her side, gently encouraging her to share her story. "What happened to you, Madame Precious?" he asked. "Why do you feel your life is worthless?" Precious stared at the ceiling, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made choices," she said. "Terrible choices. I thought I was living the life I wanted, but I was wrong. I lost everything, my health, my dignity, my hope." Segun listened intently as she recounted her past, each word heavy with remorse. She spoke of her glamorous life, her pursuit of wealth and pleasure, and the men who had showered her with gifts, but left her empty. She spoke of Senator Samuel, the man she had pinned all her hopes on, and how he had abandoned her after an accident left her unable to walk. But it was when she spoke of the child she had abandoned that Segun's breath caught in his throat. "I had a son once," Precious admitted, her voice breaking. "I left him in the slum when he was just a baby. I was young and selfish. I didn't want him to ruin my life. But now I see he was the only good thing I ever had." Segun's mind raced as the details began to align. The timeline, the location, her mention of abandoning a baby in the slum. It all pointed to one possibility. Could this woman be his biological mother? Overwhelmed by a flood of emotions, anger, confusion, and a strange sense of pity, Zagon excused himself from the room. He needed answers. He called David and Ngozi, his adoptive parents, recounting the encounter and the woman's story. "Do you think it could be true?" he asked, his voice trembling. Zagon's voice was calm but cautious. "It's possible, Zagon, but the only way to know for sure is to find out." Zagon knew what he had to do. He arranged for a DNA test using a sample from Precious without her knowledge. The days leading up to the results were agonizing. He oscillated between hope and dread, unsure of what he wanted the outcome to be. When the results arrived, Segun sat alone in his office at the hospital, staring at the envelope for what felt like an eternity. Finally, with trembling hands, he opened it. The words confirmed what he had suspected. Precious was his biological mother. Segun's knees buckled, and he sank into his chair, tears streaming down his face. The revelation brought a whirlwind of emotions. Relief at finding answers, anger at her abandonment, and a deep sadness for the broken woman she had become. That evening, Segun returned to Precious's hospital room, his heart heavy. She was sitting up in bed, her expression weary but curious. "Madam Precious," he began, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "There's something you need to see." He handed her the DNA test results. She opened them slowly, her hands shaking. As she read the words, her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. This can't be," she whispered, looking up at him. "You're my son." Segun nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, I'm the baby you left in the slum all those years ago." Precious let out a guttural sob, her hands flying to her face. "Oh God, my son! My son! You're alive!" She reached for him, but Segun stepped back, his pain evident in his eyes. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why did you leave me? Did I mean so little to you?" Precious broke down, her body racked with sobs. "I was young and foolish," she cried. "I thought I was doing what was best for me. But I was wrong. I've regretted it every day of my life. Please forgive me." Segun's heart ached as he watched her crumble. He had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, he didn't know what to feel. Though anger and hurt still lingered in his heart, Segun couldn't deny the sincerity of her remorse. He took a deep breath, his father David's words echoing in his mind. "Forgiveness is not for them, my son. It's for you." "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," Segun admitted, "but I'm willing to try." Precious looked up at him, her face wet with tears. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you, my son." The road to healing would be long, but for the first time in years, Precious felt a glimmer of hope. And for Segun, the encounter marked the beginning of a journey to reconcile his past with the life he had built for himself. For Segun, discovering that Precious was his biological mother felt like reopening a wound he didn't know he had. The revelation left him grappling with emotions he had long buried: anger at her abandonment, sadness for the boy he had been, and confusion over what her reappearance meant for his future. In the days following their encounter, Segun kept his distance. He threw himself into his work at the hospital, using his duties as a distraction from the storm brewing within him. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, Precious' tearful confession replayed in his mind. "You are my son," she had sobbed, "and I am so sorry for all the pain I caused you." At home, David and Ngozi could sense Segun's turmoil. They didn't pressure him to talk, but they made it clear they were there to support him. One evening, after dinner, David found Segun sitting alone on the porch, staring into the distance. "My boy," David began, sitting beside him, "I know this is not an easy time for you." Segun let out a shaky breath. "How do I forgive someone who threw me away like I was nothing? She left me to die, Dad. How am I supposed to move past that?" David placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Forgiveness is not about forgetting the pain or excusing what was done. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of that pain. Hatred will only hold you back, my son. Forgiveness is the path to healing. Ngozi joined them, her voice gentle. Segun, you are a product of love, not of abandonment. We love you as our own, and we always will. But you've been given an opportunity to heal a part of your story that we cannot. Take it, even if it takes time. Their words planted a seed in Segun's heart. Though he wasn't ready to forgive immediately, he began to see that holding on to anger would only keep him trapped in the shadows of his past. Weeks later, Segun visited Precious in the hospital. She looked frailer than he remembered, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by years of regret and hardship. When she saw him walk through the door, her eyes filled with tears. Segun, she whispered, her voice trembling. You came back. Segun nodded, his expression unreadable. I've been thinking about everything you told me, he said, sitting beside her. I can't say I'm ready to forgive you completely, but I'm willing to try. Precious sobbed, overwhelmed by his words. That's more than I could have hoped for. Thank you, my son. Over the following weeks, Segun and Precious began to rebuild their relationship, slowly but steadily. Their conversations were raw and honest, filled with tears and moments of silence as they navigated the pain of their shared past. One afternoon, Segun brought David and Ngozi to meet Precious. The meeting was emotional, with Precious breaking down as she thanked them for raising her son with so much love and care. You gave him everything I couldn't, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you for being the parents he deserved. David smiled warmly. Segun is a blessing to all of us. What matters now is that we move forward together. Ngozi added, forgiveness is not a destination, it's a journey, and we're here to walk it with you. Determined to make amends for her past, Precious threw herself into a new mission, helping children who had been abandoned or orphaned. With Segun's encouragement, she started a charity dedicated to providing shelter, education and healthcare to vulnerable children. The charity, named Second Chances Foundation, became her life's work. Precious worked tirelessly, using her story as a cautionary tale to inspire others to make better choices and to show that redemption was possible. I can't change the past, Precious often said during interviews and community events, but I can use my mistakes to ensure no child feels unwanted or unloved. As Precious dedicated herself to helping others, Segun continued to excel in his career. He graduated at the top of his class and became a respected doctor, specializing in pediatrics. His journey from an abandoned child to a celebrated physician inspired countless people. Segun often spoke about the people who had shaped his life. His adoptive parents, who had shown him unconditional love. His teachers, who had encouraged him to dream big. And even Precious, who had taught him the power of forgiveness. Life isn't about where you start, Siegel once said during a speech at a medical conference. It's about the choices you make and the people who lift you up along the way. Over time, the bond between Segun and Precious deepened. He visited her regularly, introducing her to his friends and colleagues. She, in turn, supported him in every way she could, attending his graduation and proudly cheering him on as he began his career. The three families, David, Ngozi, and Precious, became a testament to the transformative power of love and forgiveness. They celebrated milestones together, shared meals, and leaned on one another during difficult times. Precious' journey from a life of indulgence and regret to one of purpose and redemption touched the lives of everyone around her. Segun's rise from an abandoned child to a compassionate doctor served as a beacon of hope for others facing adversity. Their story was a powerful reminder that while the past cannot be erased, it does not have to define the future. Forgiveness, though difficult, can heal even the deepest wounds. What lessons can we draw from this story? Share your reflections in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable tales. Stay blessed.